Is okay. Okay, that's it. That's the only question. We're going to. I would say primarily, but it's more than primarily. We're going to focus on one word today, and that one word we're going to see what happened with it, and how people took it in all kinds of different places. Some very very far, some because of one word created an entire narrative, and we'll say just start from the beginning. I'll identify the word, and then I'll try to explain what exactly is the problem and what exactly happened. V'yu Chayeh Sarah, 100 shana v'esrim shana v'sheva shanim shnei Chayeh Sarah. So it tells us about the age of Sarah, the life of Sarah, and we're not going to delve any more into that. But Tamat Sarah Bekirat Arba Hi Chevron Be'eretz Canaan, we can just stop right there in the middle of the pasuk. It really could have started there. But Tamat Sarah Bekirat Arba, right? She died and she was 127, or she died at 127. So therefore, the inverse over here is a little curious. There is much to say about that. There's much that has been said about that, but we're completely ignoring that. Sarah dies, and it gives us a location. She dies, actually, two names, which some of you could say, well, that's interesting, two names, but what's really more interesting is that there's a third name that it could have used. And I won't pick on you and ask you what that third name should be. V'tamat Sarah b'kiryat arba, hi Chevron, be'eretz Canaan. So again, there's a lot there, and we'll see how some will take that. Vayavo Avraham, and Avram. Now, how do you want to translate Vayavo? Vayavo Avram. I'll translate it, and Avram arrived. You want a name for the share? That's what we'll call it. Avram arrived. Unless you want the arrival of Avraham, you think that's more dramatic. Vayavo Avraham, lispod l'sarah livkota. And Avram arrived Avram came to eulogize and to cry for Sarah, and some speak about the sequence, and that doesn't concern me at all. And as we continue going on, we have this dialogue, negotiations that take place between Avram and the Bnei Chet, and in Pasuk Yud Zayin it says, "Vayakam stei Ephron asher b'machpelah asher lifnei Mamre." Mamre, by the way, was the third name that could have been used, because the area which is called Mamre is at least in some kind of a correlation with Hebron and with Kiryat Arba. Again, what the correlation is a proximity, or is it identical? That is of less concern to me right now. But you do see that Mamre was just now added in as well. And now if you read at Pasuk Yutet, V'acharechen kavar v'metzar ishto el moratz dei machpera el pnei Mamre hi Chevron. So that's why I'm saying that there was a third name, but don't get fooled. That's not my main concern today to talk about that. It's instead that other thing that Avram comes, or Avram arrives, and then the question is, where does Avram come from? Now, and that also, we have to stop a second. Even though I asked the question, and I even made it sound like a reasonable question, the first thing you need to really determine if that is in fact a reasonable question, which means that, let's make this easier. Is it a turn of phrase, or is it telling us something about geography? Is it talking about a person's experience, or is it talking about, again, some kind of a geographical statement? Rashi is going to tell us really that it is a geographical statement, and Rashi is going to build a narrative, and that narrative is going to have a life unto itself, and that will eventually lead to other elements of it, and a whole story is going to be created. And again, I want to be a little careful. I had a discussion with a rabbi. It's always a bad thing to do on Tuesday, and he tells me, Rashi creates pshat. What Rashi says is pshat. Now, I understand where he's coming from. Where he's coming from is a world of confusion, which we call the Chumash, or Tanakh for that matter, and we want to try to make some kind of meaning out of the confusion. You want to make order out of the chaos. So in order to make order out of the chaos, one of the things you can do is I need rules. So one of the rules I can say is, well, give me Rashi, right? Give me Rashi, or give me death, give me Rashi, and Rashi then will determine what exactly are the basic parameters, and therefore Rashi tells him it's pshat. Now, of course, he got carried away with himself because Rashi very often doesn't tell us pshat, which of course will then take us to a far conversation, and that is what exactly is pshat. What's the best definition of pshat? Whatever I say, right? That's you ask anybody what pshat is, that's what it comes out. What they say is pshat. I mean, that's what you say is your imagination, your wild imagination, or all kinds of other motives. But that's it. That's the best definition of pshat. So don't misunderstand me on this either. Rashi is I don't want to say our first go-to. Truth is, Rashi is our second go-to, maybe even our third. The first go-to is the Chumash. Second go-to is Onkelos. The third go-to is Rashi. And that's how we are trained to read. But Rashi does a wonderful job of putting things together. And again, creating a story, creating a narrative, creating some fabric out of random strands. And that makes something really compelling and really interesting. So let's just look what Rashi does here. Avraham, and it's interesting because he's going on the words L'spod l'sara l'fakota. Again, right before the Avraham arrives, for what purpose does he arrive? If you look back in Pasuk Bet, but right, Sarah passes away, the last half of the Pasuk, Vayavo Avram L'spod l'sara l'fakota. Avram arrives in order to eulogize Sarah and to cry for her. Rashi says, V'nismacha mitat Sarah la'akedat Yitzchak. לפי שעל ידי בשרת העקדה שנזדמן בנה לשחיטה וכמעט שלא נשחט, פרחה נשמתה ממנה ומתה. So Rashi just now told us something which has to do probably with geography, but it's not just geography because it completely transcends it. It tells us that the death of Sarah is told to us right after in the text. And by the way, this is not completely true because there's something in the middle. But Rashi's telling us that the death, which is told in Perek Kaf Gimel, follows the Akedah, which was in Perek Kaf Bet. And the way that Rashi phrases it, and I didn't translate as I read it, V'nismacha mitat Sarah la'akedat Yitzchak, there is this following, and it's placed next to one another. It's samuch, it's right next to one another. The death of Sarah and the binding of Yitzchak. Why? When she got word of the Akedah, that her son was chosen and was dedicated for slaughtering, a lot of people misunderstand that's Hebrew. And it doesn't mean that he almost wasn't, and he was almost slaughtered. It's not that I know people, I've heard drashot. Why was she troubled? Because he wasn't killed. That's not what it says. Ukamat shelo nishchat doesn't mean that she was troubled. He wasn't killed. She was troubled. He was almost killed. Uporcha nishmata mimena umeta. The news of this was so dramatic and was so devastating that her soul departed and she died. So the Rashi is very straightforward that she dies. Now there is a problem, and hold on a second and I'll try to describe what the problem is. And the one who's going to do the best job in describing the problem and trying to solve the problem is going to be the Ramban, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. In source number 3 in Parshat Rabbah, we see Vayavo Avram L'spod l'sara. And here the Midrash is focusing on the Vayavo and Avram's arrival. So it asked that question, by the way, as if it's a good question. I told you from the beginning, it may or may not be, and that itself will be debated throughout the generations. Rabbi Levi Amar mikvurato shel Terach. He arrived from Terach's funeral. Now that may come as a surprise to some of you, for lots of reasons. Mikvurato shel Terach l'saraba. He arrived after attending the funeral of Terach. Omer lo Rabbi Yossi v'lukvurato shel Terach kadma lukvurato shel Sarah shtei shanim. Now let's do a little bit of the math for 1 second. Avraham is 10 years older than Sarah. We were just now told that Sarah dies at the age of 127. If you look in source number 4, Vayichi terach shivim shana, vayolad et Avram et Nachar v'Taran. Now, I don't know how to read that. I could, well, Avram's the oldest, so I don't have to wonder if they were triplets or not, because he's 70 years old, so it's probably he starts his parenting. But Avram, let's say, is 70. And let's say Avram is the oldest, because that just will make things easier. And then we're told, Vayu yemei Terach chamesh shanim u'matayim shana. Terach dies at 205. So I even was kind enough to do the math for you. The 205 minus 70 is 135. Avram's 10 years older than Sarah. That means Sarah is 127 and Avram is 137. So Avram is 137 when Sarah dies. So 135 is the age of Avram when Terach died. 137 is when Sarah died. So now you read the Midrash. Where did he come from? He came from Terach's funeral. Amr lo Rabbi Yosef, look for Terach kadmon look for Sarah shtei shanim. But it happened 2 years before. So now you know, that's exactly what's going on. Ela mehechan ba, where did he come from? Mehar HaMoriah. He had come from Har HaMoriah. And by the way, other than Avram's advanced age, and maybe the difficulty in traveling, to say that he went traveling back to where his father lived, and it took him 2 years to travel to come back, to me is not so. I'm saying to me that actually sounds perfectly reasonable. That he got word his father passed away, till the word came, till he went there, till he checked the will, till everything gets settled, and then he comes back, which means to say that's what happened is not as crazy, other than a much larger problem, and that may be that Avram never wanted to go out in that direction, because that may cancel Lech Lecha. And all that I'll say now is that if you read Perek Kaf Daled and the insistence that Yitzchak not travel there, yes, I know, again, you were Rashid, and therefore Yitzchak is a korban, and Yitzchak can't leave Eretz Yisrael. None of that is in the Chumash, and actually may be contradictory to some information in the Chumash, which is dependent on something I'm going to hopefully get to much later, but I'll say it quickly, and that is that Yitzchak does go, and he wants to go to Egypt, and that's when God stops him and says, don't stay here. But where does he stay? It's Eretz Plishtim. So what's the larger question? If Eretz Plishtim is in fact part of Eretz Yisrael or not. Now, if I were a good, proper, card-carrying ultra-Zionist, then I would say, of course it's part of Eretz Yisrael, and there's no debate whatsoever. The only problem is that God may not agree. And there may be a second indication as well, which means if Yitzchak goes to Eretz Plishtim, to go to Egypt, it doesn't mean that he was told always to stay in Israel. It was just told not to go to Egypt. Now, to take that as an argument why he can't go on a date up and find a wife, that may be for a different reason. I'm going to say it again. And this is just to give you something to think about as you read the Chumash, hopefully, or listen on Shabbat. And that is that would counter the Lech Lecha. And Avram mentions Lech Lecha multiple times along the way. It gets brought up. And it's stronger than that, because actually what Rivka is doing, she's doing her own Lech Lecha from her father's home, from her birthplace, and she's following. And I'll tell you one more thing, and now I'm really getting ahead of myself. All of us, if we did follow Rashi through, which we may as well do it right now before we proceed. And that is that if Avram coming straight from the Akedah, that means the Akedah took place when Sarah was 127. If Sarah is 127, because she dies as a result of it. If Sarah is 127, then that did something, because it turns Yitzchak into an age of 37, right? So now if Yitzchak's 37, first of all, I want all of you to admit, whether you can or you can't, it's okay if you don't do it out loud. I want you all to admit that when you read the narrative of the Akedah, it did not sound like a 37-year-old man. It sounded like somebody who was much younger. I'm just saying, please admit that. At least then we can continue. Then we can continue our conversation. Secondly, so Yitzchak's 37 years old, and here is where things go a little crazy. And some of you may be troubled by this, and if you're not troubled, then I'm troubled why you're not troubled. And the only reason you won't be troubled is because you're too frum to be troubled. Anybody who feels too frum, then just say it now. Because right then, we're told about Rivka being born. So if Rivka is being born 137, now we have more information later on. Next week's Parshat, we're going to be told that Yitzchak gets married when he's 40. We're not told how old she is. Why? Because it's not polite. So we're not told how old she was when she gets married. But Rashi comes and says, oh, I'll tell you how old she was. She was 3 years old. How do you know she was 3 years old? Because we're told of her birth right after the Akedah. So therefore, Yitzchak's 40, she's 3 years old. And some of you are going to say, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And some of you are going to say, what in the world does any of this mean? So first of all, let me tell you what it means. That's more important than anything else, to know what it means. And that is, if you realize that what Rivka is doing is she is having her own Avraham experience. The test that's being given is an Avraham test. Is she a woman of chesed? Will she do crazy chesed like Avram does crazy chesed? Go back to Avram's hometown, give a test of chesed. She passes the test of chesed. And now let me remind you of something that maybe you forgot, but that's the key to all of this. According to Chazal, how old was Avraham when he first recognizes God? Answer, 3 years old. 3 years old. Now you realize why Rivka is 3 years old, because what it's trying to say is that she is like Avraham. She is a spiritual genius full of chesed like Avraham, and then follows the Avraham experience of the Lech Lecha, leaving her home, leaving her father's. You don't know where we get it from, that that Avraham was 3. I'll tell you how we know it. It's because it says, at some point God says to Yitzchak, Ekev asher shema Avram bekoli. Ekev, because he listened. So there Chazal say in the Gemara, what do you mean Ekev? Ekev, if you do the Gematria, those of you who are big Gematria fans, Ekev equals 172. So it says that 172 out of Avram's 175 years, he recognized God, and says from here we know that Avram recognized that there's a God from the age of 3. Don't bother me about anything else. But by saying that Rivka is 3, what it's really telling you is that Rivka is like Avraham, which is the whole point to begin with, which is why the test is a test of chesed, and now at least you have insight. And again, the purpose of the Midrash is not to tell you history, it's to teach you theology. And over here, there's an idea behind it, but then we get lost behind the idea, and then you'll get people who say, I can't believe that Yitzchak married a 3-year-old girl. This is absolutely perverse. And by the way, of course it's perverse. But on the other end, it never meant to tell you that, but stronger than that. There is absolutely zero evidence. Should I be stronger than that? There's absolutely zero evidence that she was 3 years old at that time, and even the imaginary evidence, that's all that there is. There's a big difference between evidence and imaginary evidence. Because imaginary evidence is when somebody goes and tells you a story. And what happens over here is that some tell us a story. The only reason I have to, again, be a little more careful is that one of the people who tells the story is Rashi, and I don't want you to get mad at me, so I'm not going to say it like that yet. But let me just say it like this, and again, with this we can really start learning. Virtually everybody in Rashi's subsequent school, which means the Tosfot and on all of the Tosfot commentaries that I can find, they're all in complete agreement that they don't agree with Rashi. They don't go there, they don't begin to go there, they don't understand it that way. So give me a little bit of time, and I'm going to try to make sense out of some of this. So we were in the middle, minding our own business, in the middle of source number 3. And the first opinion was that he came from Terach's funeral. And the second opinion is that he came from the Akedah. We'll read that second one again. Rav Yossi, Terach was there, so on. So therefore there's a juxtaposition between the Akedah and between the death of Sarah. One follows the other because chronologically these are at the same time. Source 4 we saw, the math you saw. Source number 5 is interesting. It's a midrash, Seichel Tov. That's how one communicates, which means it's just a turn of phrase. Don't. It's a turn of phrase. We're going to see some commentaries who are going to embellish a little bit more. Somebody has a job to do, so he came and did his job. But it doesn't mean anything else. It's not a question of geography. It's a question that the person has something to do, and now he comes and he does. And now, it's interesting because the Midrash said that, and it was really good, and then it backs up. Vayavo Avraham, into the second line, Mehar HaMoriah. But by the way, I skipped the example, just for some of you, maybe that would be the most exciting thing in the class today. The example that it gave was actually by Eshe Potiphar. Kigon ba elai l'shkavimi, come and be with me. So therefore, it doesn't mean, from that he came from Har HaMoriah. It's just, come hither, right? I know I didn't use a come hither voice and therefore completely ruined it, but that is the other. You're laughing. So that's the other opinion, which is over here, and it backs up by saying, no, it doesn't mean that geographically. It's just that somebody has a task to do, and then it backs up from that And it goes, oh, Vayavo Avram, and the second line, Mehara Maria, Boto Ayom Naasa Shemet Sarah, same day, even better now, same day. By the way, that we should all be troubled by that the same day. Why should we be troubled the same day? Because it took 3 days to get there. Why did it only take 1 day to get back? Okay. Nasa Shemet Sarah, Vinatsek Lispod L'Sarah Levkota, Kedei Lekabel Aleschar. Ulamdeinu Shahayitzlak ben 37 shana kishenekad al Har, and this teaches you that he was 37 years old. Ukishneferet bayom akedato aita bat mea isrim v'sheva, and therefore he was 37. She's 127. So it's really interesting because he just gave us both interpretations, one line after the other. One is, oh, don't take the word ba all that seriously. Other, oh yeah, take it quite seriously. And it's actually we're talking about the same day. In source 6, I just made sure that I showed you that she really was 90 when she has a kid. And you don't really need that. And the same thing in 7 and 8, we know all that. Now, in 8, that's part of what I kind of bullied you about before, to say, admit that he really wasn't 37, and the problem is that he's described as a na'ar. But on the other hand, I have no idea what a na'ar means. For example, when Bat Paro meets Moshe, who's 3 months old, so yes, Rashi tries to then explain it doesn't really mean that he is crying beyond his years. Rashi says that it's more sophisticated crying. I have to mention that about my grandchildren. That's not just a cry. This is a sophisticated cry. Shows culture. Shows good genes. Anyway. The Radak, again, Radak very much likes to tell us Pshat in his understanding. Vayavo Avram ba min hachutz ki lo haya ima bebayit beit mitata. Where did he come from? He was outside. Comes inside and he sees that she died. I mean, again, he's saying, don't get excited. Obami makom acher ki lo yabachevrim b'shemeta. And then again, he does the same thing. Or maybe it is geographic. Maybe he wasn't home that day, and he came in. Rav Avram ben Harambam. Do you know who Rav Avram ben Harambam was? There you go. That was easy. So Rav Avram ben Harambam quotes his father here. And it's actually a little bit more emotional and touching than maybe you thought that the Rambam was. Vayavo Avram, hakavana b'vayavo shenichnas el makom asher meta bo, mivuhal al hipkada umitzta'er aleh ulavot gviata b'shalom. He comes in, and it's all emotional. He comes in all broken up and in shock, and he feels this obligation now. He has to take care of the corpse. Adam im meit chaviv alav, the same way that a person is devastated when a loved one passes away. V'nafsho kshurabo v'kach bi'er avi abba mari. And that, avi abba mari. I don't think it's avi abba. I don't think it's his grandfather. I think he's talking about his father, and that's how my father explained it. Essentially saying is that Avram comes in, and it's all talking about an emotional situation. It's Avram's emotions which are being described over here. Now, the most important commentary on this whole topic, but as you can tell just based on what time it is, it's not going to be our final, is going to be the Ramban. So let me stress why we like the Ramban. One is the Ramban, like Rashi, but unlike Rashi, very much likes Pshat. And he's not afraid to argue with Rashi. He's not afraid sometimes to argue with Chazal. But he'll do that when there's psukim that are staring at him and say, we need to explain the psukim. The other things about the Ramban is this, and by the way, I'm quoting now Rabbi Soloveitchik, not even necessarily on his commentary on the Chumash, but the Ramban generally, in terms of the Ramban also, in terms of his commentary on the Gemara. The Ramban is somebody who clearly, I know you're going to say, how can you say this? So that's why I had to quote Rabbi Soloveitchik. He clearly has complete command of the entire literature, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. He doesn't miss arguments. He doesn't miss sources. If there's something to bring into the discussion, he brings it into discussion. He has complete mastery in terms of the breadth of the literature, but he also has incredible, insightful understanding in terms of the depth, which means normally we would divide scholars in those two different areas. There are those who have incredible depth and those who have incredible breadth, and the Ramban is somebody who's unique in that sense that he clearly has absolutely both. He knows everything and he knows it well, and he doesn't miss things. And I'll tell you, I knew this Ramban, but I decided to do the work myself beforehand. I have to explain. I tracked along the way every place that Avraham lived. So it took me time on Sunday. It's not that hard, not all that many chapters, but read through every single Avraham narrative from the beginning until we get to this point with a simple thing, mind looking where Avram lived and when he moved and where it was, when that revelation was, when God spoke to him, when he breaks up from Lot. And again, every single step of the way, where is he at that moment? I don't know if that is interesting to any of you. Oh, it is? So you can do it also, right? And I collected it all, which means some of the sources I have later on over here, it's what I did. And then I went back and I read the Ramban, and I'll say it again, he doesn't miss anything. Because I don't think he had to work as hard as I did. I think for the Ramban, this was just, but let's read a little bit because it really is good, and he's going to throw in his geographical knowledge. Let me tell you another secret about the advantage of the Ramban. Unlike most medieval scholars, he wrote his commentary when he was in Spain, and he moved to Israel, and he made corrections on his commentary because then he realized certain things, and he wrote letters back. And actually, you can buy. By the way, because I prepared this year, I went and I ordered the book. There are the comments that the Ramban made after he moved to Israel. Somebody collected all of them to see where he changed things because he saw things and he realized things and he understands things. Where if you're sitting in France, let's like Rashi, and you're Rashi, which means it doesn't get better than Rashi, but you're still relying on books. Relying on books and relying on traditions, but you're not relying on your eyes. And you're not relying on your experiences, and that just changes things completely. So again, I think all of us who are somewhat olim chadashim, I'm here 40 years, I don't know how chadash some of you are, but again, there's a very big difference between being here and living here and seeing things, and then having people in other places discuss things that they never really saw and never really understood. And again, someone's going to conclude today, I'm just getting in on Rashi here. Rashi is working off a tradition. The Ramban worked off of tradition, and then he changes his mind on various things because he sees that there's actually a reality here. So let's start reading. And I wonder, that was part of what happened here. I wondered how much of this Ramban he wrote before he got here, and did he make any corrections or not? But let's read a little bit because it's interesting. Yes, let's read. Yes, let's read. Source 11. Vayavo Avraham. Yes, I told you. That's what we're doing today. Vayavo Avraham. Lashon Rashi mi Beersheva. Now, Rashi, I didn't show you that Rashi, but Rashi says he came from Beersheva. You should also realize that there's a little bit of a contradiction, not insurmountable, but he comes from Beersheva. But if he's coming from the Akedah, then why is he coming from the Beersheva? Again, where does she die? She dies in Hebron. Beersheva is to the south. Yerushalayim is to the north. So then what's going on? Now, the answer is what's going on is that the Torah says that Avram went to Beersheva after the Akedah. So he comes from Beersheva. Ve'ein ze lomer shehaya omed sham mima shekatuv vayeshev Avram Beersheva. Avram returns to Beersheva. So the Akedah ends. The Akedah begins, and it's not 100% clear. I think it's 99%. It's not 100% clear where God said to him to go set out and do the Akedah. Where did he start his trip from? And I'm only going to entertain right now two possibilities. Clearly, you can tell me there are more. What are my two possibilities? One is going to be where she dies, which is Hebron, and the other is going to be Beersheva. After the Akedah, the Chumash says, it's Perikaf Bet, Pasuk Yuted. If you want, we can look exactly inside. It says, Vayeshev Avram Beersheva. He returns to Beersheva. So it doesn't mean he returned because that's where he started from. It doesn't mean he returns because that's where he lived at some point along the way, which is the easier way to say it. The easy way to say it is that's where he started the trip from, which then creates a problem. Ki eich tiyeh Sarah b'Chevron. So now he has a problem. Is what's Sarah doing in Hebron if Avram just now returned to Beersheva because that's where he started from? What's she doing there? I want you to keep in mind that question because that's a really good question. And now you realize that Avram arrives, so Avram's only half of the story. The other part of the story is going to be Sarah. There's actually three halves here. The third half is where in the world is Yitzchak, but that's not for today. Aval hakavana lomar shahalach sham biyom litzurcho. That Avram just went that day because he had some work to do, some jobs to do. He had something to do in Beersheba that day. So it doesn't really mean that Avram lived there. V'shama b'mitat Sarah. Now, again, I want you to realize the practicalities of this are not all that simple. Which means Avram really has to be in Hebron, and he's going to say that clearly. And then he travels there, and then he gets word that she dies. How does he get word that she died? I mean, somebody called. In the old days, someone sent a fax. Right. By the way, if I would say it to my students, I could probably fool them. They sent a smoke signal. They had Morse code. So they had Morse code in those days. And therefore he arrives from Beersheba in order to mourn, eulogize, and so on. So again, Rashi is defensible all the time because Rashi is, when I learned with Nachama Leibowitz, she would like to say that Rashi was 95% Chazal. I actually think the percentage is higher. I think it's like 99% Chazal, and he's cutting and pasting. And sometimes there are Chazals that he's quoting from. Sorry for that word. There are Chazals he's quoting from that maybe we don't know, but I think that Rashi's brilliance is able to take the literature of Chazal and then read it back into the Torah. And he says, therefore, it seems that the instruction of the Akedah took place when he's in Beersheba. So by the way, we still have a problem because either way there's going to be a problem. So if that's the case, what's our problem now? What is Sarah doing in Hebron? Kisham Hayadar, because that's where he lived. Visham Chazar, and that's where we're going to get back to. Kikain Katuv B'tchila, because it says beforehand. Now this is immediately prior to the Akedah. This is the end of Perek Aleph. V'yita Eshel beBeersheva, v'yikra Shem b'Shem Hashem Kelo Yon. Amar, the next pasuk, Vayagar Avram be'eretz plishtim yamim rabim. So the last thing that we heard of Avram living, that he lives for an extended period of time, he lives in Beersheba, and that's right before the Akedah. That's the end of Perek Aleph. What are we told after the Akedah? Avram goes back to Beersheba. What's our conclusion then? That he lives in Beersheba. What's our problem? What is Sarah doing in Hebron? V'hu Garuto beBeersheva, shehu be'eretz plishtim, v'sham nitztava ba'akedah, v'al kain shaha b'derech shlosha yamim, and therefore the traveling took 3 days. That's the part I really liked, because therefore he has this wherewithal to understand that from Beersheba to get to Yerushalayim is going to be a 3-day journey. She be'eretz plishtim rechokam Yerushalayim, she'ilu Hebron b'har Yudahu, ki kain katuv v'karov Yerushalayim. Which is interesting. He doesn't say because I've been there. He quotes a pasuk in Yoshua, "Uv'shuvom min Akedah leBeersheva chazar," and afterwards he went back. Kamoshin Amar v'yeshev Avram el Na'arav v'yikum milchu Yaakov el Beersheba. They went to Beersheba. V'yeshev Avram Beersheba laharot shenit akev sham v'yashav bo shanim. That's where Avram was for years and years. V'mkein lo meita Sarah b'to zman, and therefore what has to be the conclusion? That Sarah doesn't die right after the Akedah. Which means the Akedah is not when Yitzchak is 37 years old. The Akedah, her death does not happen immediately, because before the Akedah and after the Akedah, the Avram and Sarah live in Beersheba. At some later point in time, it must be that they move to Hebron for whatever reason, and that's why she dies later. So now you realize it's the geography together with the chronology, which is what the challenge is over here. And he says, all the evidence points in one direction, that they live in Beersheba, so therefore, yes, she dies, but you only have a problem of what she's doing in Hebron if she dies at the same time. So therefore, how do you resolve this? You resolve this and say, no, we don't follow that teaching that he came straight from the Akedah and she died as a result of hearing about the Akedah, and she dies at the same time of the Akedah, which means the Ramban just liberated us from the juxtaposition of the Akedah to get with the death of Sarah, and now instead these two things are completely separate. And then he said, I love this because this is a child talking about his parents. It can't be that they didn't live together. That just bothers him. And it's also the case that Yitzchak was born in Beersheba. That's again all the things that he's saying here in passing. I collected all of them. I can show you one pasuk after the other, which will support each of these things. Avram artza hanegev v'yashav ben kadesh ben shor v'gar b'grar. V'avimelech amar elav hinei artzi lefanecha v'nisham be'eretz plishtim hu be'eretz Beersheva sheken katuv v'hi be'etahi v'avimelech and so on. V'en katuv shalchu elav migrar v'yichrutu Beersheva v'chein nira ki Hagar kasher hutzi oto mi beit Avram v'yom yigmel Yitzchak halcha b'midbar Beersheva. That's what it says. She went to Beersheba. So where does he live at that time? He lived in Beersheba. Shisham Yudarim aval acha yamim rabim nasami eretz plishtim u'balachevim v'nifter sham hatzadeket. And then again, towards the end of her life, they traveled from Beersheba. They must have moved to Hebron, and that's where she died. If you're going to follow that midrash, which we know he doesn't like. Why doesn't he like it? Because it's not because of one pasuk. It's because it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So he says, but if you follow that midrash, then they lived in Hebron. And that's where he got. And now what he's about to do is actually fascinating. He's now going to rework in his mind, and for all of us, the entire Akedah scenario. So instead, if they lived in Hebron, let's say they lived in Hebron. What's the evidence to live in Hebron? Because she dies right afterwards. So where does she die? She dies in Hebron. So that means that the commandment of the Akedah was when he's in Hebron. So now if he's in Hebron, what's the question going to be now? Why does it take 3 days? So hold on, he's about to deal with that. Visham nitztava umasha ama biyom shlishi v'yisa Avram einav ki lo niglalo hahar chemed elokim ad yom hashlishi. He just completely changed the complexion of the test of the Akedah. He gets there within half a day, right? By donkey, by camel, however you want, from Hebron down that road. That road there a real long time. Travels, gets there, and it's the place that God is going to. And he starts looking and looking and looking, and 1 day goes by, and 2 days go by, and he gets to the third day. By the way, how many of us would give up then? Say, listen, I did my best. I couldn't find it. Couldn't find any parking. Had to go back, and we all know that there are times that we would do that. So instead, part of the test of the Akedah is that Avram is looking and seeking and trying to find. And again, look at just that little turn of phrase, Hahar Chemed Elokim. It's that mountain, that holy place. It's mountain of God. For 2 days he wanders around the neighborhoods of Yerushalayim, the environs of Yerushalayim. And God did not want to reveal to him. For Avram achar Akedah, and then after the Akedah took place, lo shav l'makomo l'Chevron, he doesn't go back home immediately. Aval halach tchila el Beersheva makom ha'eshel shalo l'teit hoda'a al niso. He goes back to his Eishel, which was this place that Avram calls out in the name of God. And it's this place of Avram's religious experiences, and he wants to go back and share with people the Akedah. And the most important conclusion of the Akedah is that God does not want human sacrifice. The important lesson of the Akedah is not that God says, put Yitzchak on the altar. The important part of the Akedah is God said, take him off the altar, and I do not want human sacrifice, and that is absolutely not necessary. And according to this, Avram uses his experience as part of the content of his teaching that he's going to share with his followers, and therefore he goes back to where his followers are in Beersheba, Visham Shama b'mitat Sarah uba. And then while he's there, he hears about the death of Sarah, and then he comes from there. So what the Ramban just now did you realize how great it is? And we're not finished. Do you realize how great what it is? He works out for us both scenarios, and he embellishes them both, and he includes within it the human side of this, the experience of what Avraham is going through. On the one hand, how difficult it is if he really starts in Hebron. On the other hand, how then he has to share the miracle with others. And he's really trying to limit the space between these two approaches. And let's just see how much we want to skip now. He says in Beersheba.
going back to Beersheba, he would have gone for Hebron anyway. He would have taken Route 60 is very old.
Yeah, I kind of agree in that. Yeah, the question is, there are other ways which are shorter, and I suspect that there are. He may also have been trying to avoid his wife. So how was your day? Well, I sharpened the knife in the morning, right? Like,
On that note, any of the Chazal say that after they had Hagar, she was so traumatized she didn't want to be with him?
in Chazal, I don't believe that Chazal were that troubled. Most of what's going to take place in Chazal, maybe we'll look at some of it if we have time. It's much more the Satan trying to knock her off rather than it is her own trauma afterwards. Yeah.
Could it be possible that he came from Beersheba and then the Satan told her and she started heading after him and that's why she was in
Yes. We'll look at that in a second. So let's try to do all this in some kind of a sequence. And the Ramban is going to continue and tell us all of again why Beersheba is so central, and just a couple of things that you have bolded over here. B'Shem Beersheba Nasa Yitzchak Rivka, and again he brings the verses. Lafidati Kiyas L'Sara Ohel Shemo Mendet Va'amoteha Lefaneha. And then he says one other thing which is interesting. Just like Avram has his Eshel, Sarah has her tent, and he talks about the importance of her tent as well, which is a theme which absolutely should be followed up on, but not now. In source number 12, if you want Satan, if you wish to be satanic, the Siftei Kohen, who generally is a commentary, will bring us more Kabbalistic type of ideas. Vayavo Avram Beersheba v'imtom mi holicha l'sar l'Chevron. Who brought her to Chevron? Shamati. So again, you want to know if Chazal say it. So what we actually have is him saying, I heard. Whenever someone says I heard as opposed to that I saw, so it's also interesting. Shamati. Kishabaha Satan va'amar la hechan Yitzchak. Satan comes and says, where's that son of yours? Amrlo halachim aviv. He went with his father. Lilamdo ma'aseh korban. His father went to teach him about korbanot. Amarlo hu korban. So the Satan says he's the korban. Lo himinalo. She didn't believe him. Holcha etzel achimaman shishai v'talmi. Amr lahem atem aruchim. You're very tall. V'ro'im mirachok, and you can see from afar. Hibitu, take a look. V'ro'u im ter'u zaken achad olechem shlosha na'arim. Tell me if you can see. Now, by the way, also there's an interesting thing just about in terms of the location. Again, it very much sounds like she is going and on the way in a place that you can look and a place that you can see. And therefore, instead of Beersheba, you're going up towards the mountains. And this actually does bring us towards Chevron. Amurlo, anuro im zakin achad, oked bachur achad, v'zakin biyado miyad meta. So therefore, it's not subsequently that the trauma, it's right then the trauma. As he said, she then does follow afterwards. So then you have this kind of tragic description of Avraham going on the way towards the Akedah and Sarah not believing it for a second, but going afterwards and saying this can't really be, and she doesn't want confirmation. She wants confirmation that it's not the case. In source 13, Rav Kasher in the Torah Shlema brings, again, it's not exactly the same, but it's a similar kind of thing, and again, it brings the Satan into it. Where's Avram? He went to do work. V'Yitzchak, where is he? And the second line, Amar lo imo halach l'mo Torah. He went to learn. Amar la aluvaz zakena, right? And goes on. What are you talking about? He went to kill him, and she doesn't believe him. And the Satan fails according to this, and then he kind of gives up and he tries to mess other things up. So that's as far as it'll go. Rav David Tzvi Hoffman in source 14, he tells us that the whole insistence about telling us about where this is, where she's buried, Chevron, Kiryat Arba, is all because look at where it's bolded. Tosefet zu mochicha et hasharatenu de la'el sheperkenu nichtav miyuchad b'shvil b'nei Yisrael sheb'midbar. B'pnei ma yotzarech lachzor ladgish shechevron mokum k'for adam shel avot be'eretz Canaan hi shochenet He says that the reason it's written the way that it's written is in order to instill the idea within the generation that's going to enter into the land of Israel of the centrality and the importance of Hebron. Now, again, some of you can counter and say, but all of Eretz Israel is holy, and some of you can even say, but Eretz Plishtim is also holy. Again, there may be a lot more over here that is not being said, but is between the lines. 15, we see that Avraham. You see this is where you may not have got it, but you should have. No, you should have gotten it. It's Avram's tent when he separates from Lot. Where does he live then? So now you also know that all the times that we heard Alone Mamre, all of this is there. Later on, again, that is 15. In 16, when Avram's told that Lot was kidnapped, where is he? Bolane Mamre. Again, that's where he is. When Avram is going to God is going to, and the three men and so on are going to come over here. Hashem Mamre. That's Hebron. Again, all of this is Hebron. When Avram is going to go back in source 18, this is the middle of stone being destroyed. That's up on the mountain, right up on the hills in the area of Hebron, looking down towards stone. Again, all of these Avram experiences, all of these things are taking place. As I said, I just collected them for you in source number 20. This is when Hagar and Ishmael sent away the Midbar. That's Beersheba. Again, we're still in Parakaf Aleph, which is source 21. Again, we're going to have things taking place by Beersheba. And then we saw something that the Ramban already told us about, and that is at the very end, that there's some kind of religious experience that Avram has. That's where we get, it's very interesting, because where is Avram's tent that he opens it up for people, and that we actually see the people coming in? That happens by Hebron. On the other hand, where does he build his Eshel? That's down there by Beersheba, ostensibly taking people in from the desert. Vayagar Avraham be'eretz Plishtim yamim rabim, and he lives by Eretz Plishtim, which is down by Beersheba, for a very long time. That is the pasuk right before the instruction of the Akedah. So then you have to ask yourself a question. So where did he get that instruction? What does it sound like? It very much sounds that's where it was. In source 22, Rav Hirsch is actually quite devious. I have to discuss this with some people. I have some relatives who are descendants of Hirsch. He essentially knew that he had to go to Yerushalayim and then offer Yitzchak, so he sends her away. He goes, "Oh, why don't you go on vacation today? Why don't you go up to Hebron and visit the friends at Hebron?" Yeah, he completely devious over here. First he notes, Vayovo Avram, he comes back and he doesn't find his wife, and then he goes back and he tells us, Lafish Lakto El Har Shlefnei Lachto El Har Moria, Hirchik Avram Etzar Mi Beersheva LeChevron, Kidei Shelo Tikabel Pesarot Atzar Bapeta. In order to ease her somehow to this whole thing, he didn't want her around, and he sent her away. And I hope no husbands are listening right now.
So the distance between, if you drive to Beersheba, it's like 110 kilometers. I mean, maybe straight line, it would be 70.
Okay.
Which means by camel could be 3 days.
Exactly. That's the Ramban's point. That's exactly what the Ramban says. 3 days makes sense if it's Beersheba. 3 days doesn't make sense if it's Hebron. If it's Hebron, then he gets there right away, but he wanders around a bit. And I'm saying it's such an interesting point because what he does is he takes the geography and then he adds in the human experience as well. I'm saying that again is why the Ramban is absolutely fascinating. 23, 24, 20 is also Yaakov. We're going to see that Yaakov leaves Beersheba. And look at source 24, and then I'm going to finish with that and try to finish up for today. Vayavo Yaakov el Yitzchak aviv Mamre Kiryat Ha'arba Hi Hebron Asher Gasher Avram v'Yitzchak. That's the best pasuk, by the way. That's like the most convincing one. Is that when Yaakov comes back after his entire sojourn, we're told that where does he go? He comes to Mamre Kiryat Arba, and that's Hebron, and that's where Avram lived, and that's where Yitzchak lived. But by the way, all that's only partially true. Because a lot of Yitzchak's life, right, prior to Yaakov leaving, where does he leave? He leaves from Beersheba, right? Do I have to convince you of that? I just read the pasuk, right? And when he comes back to Hebron. So therefore, if you want, you can say, okay, the parallel of leaving Beersheba but coming back to Hebron, if that's where Sarah dies, then you have a direct parallel in terms of Yaakov leaving and Yaakov coming back. But we'll leave it at that. Source 26 is Akedah. It doesn't tell us where he leaves, but the previous pasuk was he was in Beersheba. And let's continue a little bit more. By Yom HaShlishi, you now know why that is bolded. And then pasuk Yutet, Vayashav Avram El Na'arav v'yakum yichuyachto ve'el Beersheba. Vayeshev Avram beBeersheba. So Avram goes, returns, settles in Beersheba. So that's where we thought he was. Now, I just want to pause there for a second. The Akedah was not immediately before the death of Sarah because we have a couple more psukim here. Pasuk Kaf, Kaf Aleph, all the way through Kaf Dalet. So let's not skip 4 psukim. I think we read it twice last Shabbos. We had a Levi who became a grandfather. So the father had, the bris was that day. That's what it was. So we had to give an aliyah both to the father and to the grandfather. V'yachar adrim ha'ele, v'yugad la'avram leimar, hine yodam milka gam hi banim lo nachar achicha, et utz b'charov v'buz achiv v'etz k'mor aviyaram, v'et kesed v'et chazov v'et peler. I'm going to skip a little bit Betuel. V'bil yarad Rivka. Shmona eli yodam milka lo nachar achi Avram. Now, we're just told that Rivka is born. So if Rivka is born now after the Akedah, Yitzchak's 37 in the Akedah, that means that Yitzchak is married at 40. And how old is Rivka? Rivka is 3. Now, I hope that I told you there's no evidence before. And now I hope that none of you can say, well, how could you say there's no evidence? There's evidence right here. So there's one thing which is missing. If you're going to insist that she was born after the Akedah, then I'll also tell you so was her father. Right? We're told of her father's birth after the Akedah. You want to read it again now? V'yachadrim ele vayugad la'avram. Should we skip that word, vayugad? What does vayugad mean? And he was told. Now, does that mean that it happened then? I don't know why I have to work so hard. Does that mean that it happened then? Or does that mean that he was informed then? He neyolda milkugam hi banim lenachor achicha et utz b'charot v'et buz achiv et k'mo aviyaram v'et and so on v'et Betuel u'betul yelad et Rivka. So therefore, Betuel, he was told that there was this continuity in terms of the family, that they have children and grandchildren and so on. It does not say, do I have to stress this? It does not say that Rivka was born then. Should I say this again? How old is Rivka when she gets married? 0 evidence. How old is Rivka when she dies? 0 evidence. There's nothing. Should I say that again? There's absolutely nothing in the Chumash that tells you anything about it. That doesn't mean that people don't think that they can read between the lines occasionally. And of course, people think they can read between the lines, but sometimes you want to try to create some kind of understanding. The Abarbanel in 28, he actually creates his own wonderful narrative in all of this. But I want you to pay attention to this Abarbanel because he's going to do some interesting things, and we're going to do some interesting things with it. First of all, he's troubled about why the information wouldn't have flowed earlier. And then there are people going back and forth, and how many years have just now gone by within their lives. Again, Avram's been away for an extended period of time. Has there been no information whatsoever? Again, how much knowledge or not? Kahn, okay. What does he claim? What does it mean, gam he? What's the gam there doing there? Abarbanel's great, because what does he say? Just like Sarah suffered from infertility and could not have children, according to Chazal, it's her sister, Milcah, she also couldn't have children. And when Sarah miraculously has a child, she miraculously has a child. So that's the gam he. So that, again, that is really interesting what he says. Again, if Avram didn't know what's going on 20 years till he was informed, but he says here, Shogad Avram hine Milka achot Sarah yoda gam hi lenachar achicha banim v'shraui shetitchatein behem ki kfar noda Rivka mibanav v'yaytanu tad Avram yitzad aviyah. Essentially saying is that some kind of a miracle over here has taken place, and therefore let the miracle, children, as it were. By the way, even though Rivka is a grandchild, let the miracle children over here marry one into the two families, and that seems to be what's appropriate. Is there anything here? Good. And he also claims via Nachon lomar shekasher nifkada Sarah nifkada achota milka ima kidivreim zal v'shekvar yaduze bebeit avim k'mishpat achim el shemamar zeh v'yihi achrei divim me'ela hu dugmat v'yachner me'ela v'elkim nisat Avraham shenemar lamala ki ratzah lechtov lagid she'acharei sh'nolad Yitzchak lavim v'garash yishmo mibeitov v'shenichpad im Avimelech v'karu shnei dvarim ha'echad ha'sakanat she'b'yitzchak b'shah kedah. I know I'm reading quickly, but let me tell you what he says. He's claiming that it didn't happen afterwards. He's saying is that by you God, it's filling us in on information that Avram already knew, which means Rivka was born before the Akedah, according to Rabbi now. And then it goes back and tells us, again, which things. So it's going back a while, and it's saying that again, so what's the importance over here? Is that Rivka was not born. And that's really what he's getting at. He says, Rivka was not born that day. Rivka was born prior to this. Anything else that we want here? Now let's look at the Ibn Ezra, source 29. Yes? Ibn Ezra. This is V'chazal Omru, it's bold, Shehaya Yitzchak kasher ne'akad ben 37 shanim, ve'im divrei Kabbalah nikabel. If this is, and I'm going to edit what he said, an essential part of tradition, I'm a frum Jew and I accept tradition. Ubederech svara ein ze nachon. But if you're going to ask me logic, it makes no sense whatsoever. He goes, so the Ibn Ezra is great. And continue. So some say 30. Some say he was only 5 years old at the time. He goes, that doesn't make sense either. Because he's carrying all the wood. By the way, if you continue this argument, then a 3-year-old girl was also not carrying all the water. Right? So I'm just saying. So it's 10 camels.
What?
10 camels.
It was 10K?
Yeah. V'hakarov al hadat shahaya karov l'shloshes reishana. And the thing that makes the most sense is that Yitzchak was probably around 13 years old by the time of the Akedah, which means that Sarah is going to die a long time afterwards, and he stays with that. And let's just see how else we can put this together. In source 31, there's a tradition mentioned in the Sifri that there were a couple people that lived the same amount of time. 2 of them were Rivka and Kahat. This is the only, I told you, we have no idea how old Rivka was when she died. Kahat, we know, died at 133. That's in source 32. Shalosh Shoshimu Ma'at Shana, 133. So now you know there's a midrash that says she also died at 133. So now if she died at 133, but we don't know when she died. So now Chazal also go, and it's a little bit of a stretch. If you look at source 33, it says, "V'tama Dvorah mineket Rivka v'tivatachat lebeitel tachat alon v'koshma alon bachot," and that's the place that people cried. So why is there so much crying? Rashi says that there's an Agadah, nitbarser sham be'evil sheni shehu gadlo. I hope you appreciate the hugad. Shehu gadlo al imo shometa. That's when Yaakov found out that his mother passed away. Now, if that's the case, we know exactly more or less when it happened, because we can do the math for when Yaakov goes and how long he's away and how long it takes to come back. It actually takes him 2 years to travel back. There's 6 months there. But I'm not getting into all the things. Essentially, if you do all the math, and she dies then at 133, then she could not have been 3 years old at the time, because there's not enough time. What I just now kind of explained is found in source 35, Midrash Gadol, Amru bat Arba'as Shana Rivka Kishini said. She was 14 years old when she got married. I just want to see it. The Chizkuni, the Seder Olam, you'll see there's 2 different versions of it. The 38 says that he was 37 and she was Rivka bat Yud Daled or Gimel. There's 2 traditions. Either she was 14 or she was 3. And the reason why you have to get to 14 is because they're taking that 133 years old as an end date and assuming she died at that particular time, and then you don't have enough years, and then you have to reject that she was 3 years old. Essentially, what's going to happen then is all of the Balei HaTosfot go in that direction. I want to say one more thing, and then we'll finish up here. First, I have to explain a little bit about what we did, and maybe I went a little bit too much laterally. If you claim that this is all together, that Yitzchak Akedah, 37 years old, Rivka dies immediately, then you are kind of stuck. Sarah dies immediately, and then you're kind of stuck right there. You're stuck because all of this happens together. It is then coming together. The chronology, the geography, and the narrative all come together, and that's pretty much what we're told as kids. On the other hand, you see that there are massive problems with this, not the least of and then you continue with that, and then again following Rashi. And Rivka's born at that point, so therefore she's 3 years old, and he's 40, and then we enter into our other chronological issues. On the other hand, we find people rejecting just about every single part of this, based some of it on the geography, starting there. That this doesn't make sense. Why is Avraham going back to Beersheba? And on the other hand, we find this whole contention. If you take the Ibn Ezra for a second, and you put it together with the Abarbanel, so according to the Ibn Ezra, Yitzchak is 13 years old at the time of the Akedah. According to the Barbanel, Rivka was born before the Akedah, and we don't know exactly how old she is at this point. Rivka could have been 13 years old as well at the time of the Akedah. I can just as easily, based on the Psukim, come to the conclusion that they are exactly the same age, rather than say that he was 40 and she was 3. I'm just going to say it again. That he's 40 and she's 3 is completely artificial. I can just now use this Mefarish and that Mefarish and that Mefarish and put it all together, and I have it absolutely impossible that she was 3 years old. And I'm going to say it again. That's the approach of the Balei HaTosfot. They just can't even begin to accept it, but it all goes down because they're counting backwards from 133, and there's not enough time otherwise. But even that is not something based on the Chumash. I told you, 2 more things that I wanted to point at. One is source 40 is the Emek Davar, and the other is 41, the Toldot Yitzchak. The Netziv in 40 tells us, very simply, that Hebron's a holy city. Remember, we're told that Avraham lived there and Yitzchak lived there. It's a holy city. Right? He says, Shadar Sham Yitzchak, right? And it goes on. Why? Look at the language. Mishum shagar shem Avraham Yitzchak hiya ir shenitkadsha b'torah v'avodah miyimot avotav. This is the place that Avraham really established his tent. Originally, this is the place which is holy. That's why Yitzchak moved there. That's why Yaakov, when he comes back to Eretz Yisrael, goes there. That this is the holy city. Hebron is the holy city. Of course, you can say, but what about Beersheba? It's source 41. This is Rabbi Yitzchak Karo, right? Those of you who've been coming a while have met him before. He raised Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was his nephew. Over here, he quotes his brother, Rabbi Ephraim Karo. I'm 99% sure that's Yosef Karo's father. I didn't check on him. I was thinking on the way here, I'll call my wife, I'll tell her to Google this, and then I said, you know what? I'm not going to bother her. V'chacham Rabbi Ephraim Karo Zatzal, Achi, Heshiv la'elu Sfegar Amar, שהכוונת אברהם התחילה להיקבר הוא ואשתו בארץ כנען. לפי שארץ כנען, ארץ ישראל מכפרת עוון, שנאמר, וכיפר אדמתו עמו. They wanted to be buried in Eretz Canaan, just like lots of Jews want to be buried in Eretz Israel. And he goes on and says, לפיכך כשהרגישה בעצמה אפיסת הכוחות, when she felt old and she felt she's going to die soon, יתרון החולשה וידעה שלא תאריך ימים, and she knew she wouldn't live much time, Tzifta shayulcheh lechevron lemot sham. She asked to be brought to Hebron, to die in Hebron. Ulezeh Omar be'eretz Canaan. Kloma v'tmat Sarah be'kirat Arba he Hebron, and that's why it adds the fisha he be'eretz Canaan. Ulezeh v'yov armi Beersheba shehi eretz Plishtim ve'eno eretz Canaan. So therefore, no, she wanted to. Anybody want to do anything political with this? Have a good time. Don't quote me, but it's interesting. And it's great. It's absolutely great what he says. Because again, let's just push the chronology issues aside, because anyway, they weren't convincing. What do we find at the end? We find is that they live there in Beersheba, and Avram does his work there. He does his outreach work, and the people come in from the desert, and he gives them some fruit, and he says, make a bracha. All that is great. But when she gets old and she has this premonition that she's going to pass away soon, she goes, let's move back to Hebron. I want to be buried in Hebron. I want to die in Hebron. And it's the same feeling that Jews, again, we understand this. Listen, there are a lot of Jews who move to Israel. Some don't move to Israel. Some they're afraid to say at this point, Lashana Haba B'Yushalayim, because they know they're only coming afterwards. But nonetheless, she's the first one who says then, I want to be buried in Eretz Canaan. Please take me to Hebron. They're in Hebron, and therefore Sarah dies in Hebron. I think it's just a beautiful interpretation, and it actually solves, I think, most of what we had seen as our problem today. Have a good Shabbos.